Welcome to Bebop Scales. I'm Scott Black, and I am talking today in lesson 3 about the dominant bebop scale. There's going to be 2 lessons on the dominant bebop scale, what I call the arpeggio loop and the scale loop. Lesson 3 that we're seeing now is about the arpeggio loop. So let's get started. So in this case, we're going to talk about D minor G7. And the important thing to remember about the dominant bebop scale is that the scale that is used is based on the dominant chord, but it is for the minor chord or the dominant chord. It does not matter whether you're playing the minor chord or the dominant chord. You use the dominant bebop scale in a 2/5 situation. The other thing to remember is the key that the dominant bebop scale is in. D minor G7 is in the key of C, and so the default scale is the C major scale, and the chromatic passing tone and harmonic tone that's added is a F sharp or a G flat. It's usually indicated in my page over here on the right or left as a G flat. Okay, so as you recall, the reason we use that scale is by going G, G flat, F. We get both G and F, which are G7 chord tones, to fall on downbeats. And the whole object of bebop scales is to control and establish the sound of the chord by getting chord tones on downbeat. When we look at the arpeggio loop, the thing that's important to realize is we are choosing 3 of the notes that are most commonly used for spelling the sound of the chord. But you can play an arpeggio from every note in the corresponding key center. So if I was to play a minor 7th chord scale starting on the root of the 2 chord, it would sound like, and I can play a 4-note arpeggio from every one of those notes. All those notes make sense to play arpeggios from, but the ones that we're going to talk about here that are described in this figure on the screen that are the most commonly played are from the root of the minor 7th chord. We play a 4-note arpeggio up and a bebop scale down from the root of the minor 7th chord. The second most commonly played arpeggio, based on looking at solos by Charlie Parker and all the people that use this language, is from the 3rd to the 9th of the minor chord. And then the next most commonly played arpeggio is from the 3rd to the 9th of the dominant chord. If we play all of those in our practice as expediently as possible, in other words, in as short amount of time as possible, I would start over here on the 3rd of the dominant chord. I would play down to this note here, the tonic of the 2 chord, then play this arpeggio up here, play down to this note here, the 3rd of the 2 chord, and play this arpeggio, and I'll go ahead and play this whole thing down. So if I was to practice the arpeggio loop in as short amount of time as possible, I would start on the 3rd of the dominant, then go to the tonic of the 2, and then the 3rd of the 2. So that would be the fastest way that I can get through the loop, and I'd recommend learning this loop just like that in all the keys. A really important thing, especially if you're a trumpet player like me with a limited range and even less time spent practicing the trumpet, I'm going to want to limit the range that I have to play with, and this line down at the bottom that I call inversions is very important. Instead of having to play a B up to a high A, which might or might not come out when I play it, I can play the same notes, B, D, F, A, but go down. So the inversions, instead of going, I go. So that would be an example of playing each one of the 3 arpeggios that are described up above in their inversion forms. So what you should do with this information is you should decide an arpeggio to play, connect it with a scale, and then play another arpeggio. I recommend just doing that and figuring out how you can play an arpeggio and a scale and another arpeggio, and have that be a complete idea. And I can be aware of it and use the inversions. So, for example, if I was to do that and I'm practicing home and it's arbitrary, that would be an example of playing arpeggio up, playing a scale down, then ending with an inversion of the arpeggio. And if I just want to ramble on and on and on, make sure that I have this under my fingers, then I can just kind of, the reason I call it a loop is because since chord tones always fall on the downbeat, and the arpeggio notes are B, D, and F, which is the 3rd, 5th, and 7th of the dominant chord, those chord tones are always going to be on a downbeat. So as I play an arpeggio on a scale, I can play another arpeggio anytime I get to a B, D, or F, or not. And I can play it in any direction. So if I just ramble on playing this just for the purpose of figuring out new ideas and making sure I have it under my hands, it might sound like this. Okay, at one point I cheated by playing an arpeggio that made me come down from the 6th on a downbeat. And that's really important to understand and be able to do. And we will cover that in looking in lesson 4 at the scale loop and then combining the arpeggio loop with a scale loop. So I hope this makes sense to you. And now we're going to talk about adding more half steps and getting more practical use out of this by understanding the scale loop in lesson 4. And I can't wait to see you then. Thanks.